Good evening. I'm Lisa DeSisto, publisher of the Portland Press Herald, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for Maine Voices Livestream. We couldn't be more excited to bring you Dr. Jessica Meir. We have people from all over the earth tuning in, so please open your chat window, make sure it's set to panelists and attendees so they can see your comments, and let us know where you're watching from. And please support your local news source wherever you are. No one lets you know what's happening in your world better than the reporters and photographers who live in your community. Now, we'll be taking audience questions at the end. I see some have already come in. Please use the Q&A button to submit at any time, or if you raise your hand, you can ask it live. But don't worry, everyone else is muted. Thank you to HM Payson, our presenting sponsors from the beginning of Maine Voices. Whether we're in person or online, they are always there to support us. Thank you to Stroudwater Lodge, Murray, Plum and Murray, Portland Downtown, and Hub Furniture. Their support for this program allows us to bring it to all of you and also helps support our journalism. And now to introduce you to tonight's host and guest. Gillian Graham has been working as a journalist in Maine since 2005 and joined the Press Herald as a staff writer in 2012. She covers York County, early morning breaking news, and is a prolific collector of Pyrex. Dr. Jessica Meir was born and raised in Caribou, Maine. So for a little Maine geography, that's about 5 hours north of Portland and about only 20 minutes to the Canadian border. She was selected by NASA in 2013 and served as a flight engineer on the International Space Station for Expedition 61 and 62 from 2019 to 2020. She holds a BA in biology from Brown University, an MS in space studies from the International Space University, and a Ph.D. in marine biology from Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Please welcome Gillian Graham and Dr. Jessica Meir.
Hi, Jessica. It's great to have you here with us tonight.
Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be here in some way, to be in Maine with all the travel restrictions in place right now and the situation on the ground. I haven't been able to return to Maine yet from coming back from space, but hopefully I'll get to do that soon.
Oh, we hope so as well. Well, I, like many people in Maine and across the country, followed with great interest your journey over the last few years, and especially in the past year. But I want to start by talking about this past weekend, which was an exciting one with the launch of the SpaceX Crew Dragon. So I was hoping that you could tell us about what it was like to watch that, what you were thinking about as that event was taking place this weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. It has been an incredibly exciting time for all of us, especially here at NASA and in the astronaut office. We have been waiting for this moment for a while now to have the capacity to once again launch humans from the Kennedy Space Center and right from the US again. As I'm sure many of you know, we haven't done that since the space shuttle retired in 2011. And although we've been relying exclusively on the Russian Soyuz rocket to get us to the International Space Station, that's how I got there, and I absolutely love that experience. That is one of the most valuable things of all of my time here at NASA, was living and working with our Russian colleagues over in Star City, the Cosmonaut Training Center. So I wouldn't trade that for the world. And the international partnership, it's important to remember that is going to continue in the future of the International Space Station and beyond. Those international partnerships are crucial to the program. But of course, it is great from a national prestige, national pride standpoint that we're once again launching from the US. And it is also really great for the planet because it means we have yet another rocket, yet another spacecraft capable of carrying humans to space. So it's a very exciting time for us here at NASA. We call it kind of the season of test flights. We have the SpaceX test flight, which will now certify their vehicle to carry astronauts regularly to the space station. Pretty soon we should have Boeing come online with their vehicle, and then not too far from that we'll have the Orion vehicle that NASA is developing to go beyond low Earth orbit, beyond the International Space Station, and to return to the moon and eventually to get to Mars. So it's a very exciting time to be an astronaut right now.
Yeah. Well, as Lisa mentioned, when we first started, you grew up in Caribou, and many of us have heard stories about you wanting from the time you were very young to be an astronaut. So tell us, if you could, about how that came about and what your childhood was like growing up in Caribou.
Maine is a great place to grow up. I think everybody watching this probably knows that. And it was, for me, I grew up as the youngest of 5 kids. So I had a lot to aspire to, a lot to live up to, and I kind of embraced all of that. I think I tried to emulate all of my older siblings, and they were worth emulating for sure. They were incredible role models, as were both of my parents. So from the time I was really young, I was just trying to be like them, which means it was involved in everything from music to sports to academics and everything all around. And I think it was such a nice place to grow up because, like many of you, I'm sure when you were young, we could go outside and ride bikes over to my best friend's house and walk to school, and we would just kind of go out and play outside for hours on end, and no one was really worried about any of that stuff. And I think having that active lifestyle and having that proximity to nature was something that was pretty formative for me in my early years. We had a log cabin at Madawaska Lake, and so we would go there, and a lot of times in the summers and some other times as well, and being out in the forest and having that access to nature, I think, was really important to me. My mom is Swedish, and Swedes are notorious for having this close connection to nature. So maybe that was one of the reasons too that gave me this affinity for exploring and for understanding, wanting to understand more about the world around me, and turning me into a biologist, and then eventually into this job as an astronaut.
Well, after you graduated from Caribou High School, you left Maine to pursue higher education. Talk to us about that path that you took for your degrees and that led you eventually to NASA.
Yeah, so biology, as I mentioned, that was always my favorite subject. And I had so many inspirational, especially my science teachers, I always remember up in Caribou. They were really, really instrumental in, I think, forming these goals and these desires and fueling that passion for science. And when I graduated from Caribou High School, I went on to Brown University, where I did decide to pursue a degree in biology and to foster that. At the same time, of course, I was trying to fuel this passion for spaceflight since I'd wanted to be an astronaut. I think everybody in Caribou knew that about me from the time that I was 5 years old. I was saying that. So I was sort of doing both in parallel, trying to involve myself in any space-related activities that I could find. And there were some of those at Brown, a summer program I did at Kennedy Space Center, and then the Reduced Gravity Student Flight Opportunities campaign here in Houston, where college students were able to design an experiment and actually get a flight on the Vomit Comet, the aircraft that would fly in a parabola shape. Basically, you get about 30 to 35 seconds of weightlessness as you're falling from the top of the parabola to the bottom of the parabola. Essentially, you're in free fall, falling back to the Earth. So I was fortunate enough to be selected, me and a few other students, that designed an experiment on that. After that, I went on to the International Space University. When I graduated from Brown, I knew that I wanted to do an advanced degree, but at the time I was kind of thinking about maybe medicine or maybe doing a Ph.D. I hadn't quite decided. And I found out from somebody that worked in the lab with me about the International Space University, which was in Strasbourg, France, a year-long master's degree in the heart of Europe, and everything I was already interested in, this really interdisciplinary, intercultural degree, everything about space, ranging from space law, medicine, orbital mechanics and physics, engineering, everything. So it was really this diverse skill set with everything to do with space. So I knew that would be a great opportunity, and it was only a year long. So I did that. And after that, I actually came to Houston, to the Johnson Space Center, and worked as a scientist for 3 years, supporting experiments for human life science experiments. So all of the things, it's kind of ironic, or maybe it's just kind of come full circle now, all of the experiments that before I was supporting from the ground, working with the scientists and training the astronauts, now those experiments are being carried out on me. Now I'm serving as a subject for those experiments. So I was here in Houston for 3 years in that job before I went to graduate school. I attended the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, again, really fueled by that curiosity of understanding more about the world around me and biology and nature and how things work. And I was particularly intrigued by the diversity in the animal kingdom and understanding how animals that exhibited these extraordinary behaviors, like deep divers and high flyers. How do they do that? What is it unique about their physiology that allows them to do that? So I did my PhD at Scripps for 6 years and had a lot of amazing opportunities doing research in the Antarctic and various places in California. Then I went on to do a postdoc at the University of British Columbia, and that was a phenomenal time. You know, now I'm kind of circumnavigating North America, I guess, at this point after returning to France. And, you know, the Pacific Northwest, it's kind of like the Northeast, and it has all that beauty with the pine trees and the ocean and nature. And that was a wonderful experience living there as well. And I did research that time with another extreme. So instead of an animal diving and holding its breath for a long time, which I had done during graduate school, studying things like emperor penguins and elephant seals and how they can dive for as long as they do, I switched gears during the postdoc to high altitude animals. So same kind of thing. They're not holding their breath when they're at high altitude, but they have much lower levels of oxygen. So how does their physiology tolerate that? And there I studied the Barheaded goose, which is the species of goose that migrates twice a year over the Himalayas. So the tallest mountains on the planet, only a third to a half the amount of oxygen that we have here at sea level, but somehow they're able to support flight, which is really the most energetically, the most oxygen requiring form of any kind of locomotion. So we were studying Barheaded geese. From there, I kind of kept going in the circle and went back to the East Coast, and I was in Boston only for about 9 months with an assistant professorship through Harvard Med School and Massachusetts General Hospital. And then I was, you know, still doing the same kind of research with these animals in extreme environments. And then that's when this opportunity came along for me to be able to apply once again for my dream job. And it was something that I couldn't really miss out on when I was offered that opportunity.
I want to talk a little bit more about those Barheaded geese. So you raise them from eggs. So can you talk more about the work that you were doing with them and what that was like for you?
Yeah, so the Barheaded goose, as I mentioned, it's the species that migrates over the Himalayas. And this species had been studied for many years, but mostly at rest or in a laboratory setting. So we knew already that this animal had some extraordinary adaptations that help it, that enable it really to complete that iconic migration over the Himalayas. But nobody had really measured those with a whole organism, a whole physiology level, seeing what was happening with the heart and the blood and the muscles and the lungs, all of that integrated at once while the animal was flying. So we designed sort of this overly ambitious plan to train geese to fly in a wind tunnel. And this was a postdoctoral research project that was supported by the National Science Foundation. And I realized it was certainly more than I thought. I was getting into a lot more than I thought at first, and it ended up being a pretty large scale project, and definitely I think the most difficult thing I've ever done. But it was very, very enjoyable. So the idea was that we needed to imprint these birds in order to get them to train to fly successfully in the wind tunnel. Because if you just took a wild animal or a wild goose and tried to get it to fly in a wind tunnel, it would be you'd be measuring probably a fear response. You know, you'd have an elevated heart rate, you'd have all of these elements because that animal would be scared of you, it wouldn't want to be held, it wouldn't want to be touched, it wouldn't want to wear the experimental equipment that we would need. So the idea was to take advantage of this imprinting instinct, which is very strong, particularly in birds like waterfowl. So the first thing that they see after they hatch from the egg, they will look at as their parental figure. And so they will go to it and follow it and look to it for everything that they need to survive really in the world. So I found a source of Barheaded geese, and there was a park, the Sylvan Heights Waterfowl Park in North Carolina, and they actually had some Barheaded geese, and they had some eggs. And I talked to them, and I didn't know anything about waterfowl. I didn't know anything about raising a bird. I had worked with emperor penguins, but obviously a much different kind of bird. So they taught me. They were amazing. The staff there were really amazing at teaching me everything I needed to know. I actually went down there and got there in time for the eggs to hatch. And then I was the first thing that the birds saw. So they thought I instantly became Mother Goose, a real live modern Mother Goose. goose. And I had 12 goslings, and they imprinted on me, so they absolutely thought that I was their parent. So we would go on long walks, you know, in those early first weeks as they were growing in North Carolina. We wanted to wait to really make sure that that imprinting instinct was ingrained in them, and then they were large enough to fly them back to Vancouver. And we had a wind tunnel suitable. One of the difficult parts of the project was to find a wind tunnel large enough to fly these geese, since they have a really wide wingspan. And most wind tunnels that are around that are big enough, they're more for airplane testing. So their speeds are running at like Mach airplane speeds, so not suitable for a goose. So that was difficult, but it turned out that we actually had one at the University of British Columbia in the engineering department. So we brought the birds back there and trained them to fly in the wind tunnel. And we also trained them from the time that they were young to wear different types of experimental equipment so that would seem normal and familiar to them. So there was actually a custom mask that we made out of a dental mold material. And so it was a thin layer of plastic that fit over their beak. And then we had some hoses coming out so we could measure the air that they exhaled. So we were measuring the carbon dioxide that they produced and also the oxygen that they were breathing. So if you do that, you can calculate what we call metabolic rate, basically just oxygen consumption, how much oxygen they're using. So we measured both of those parameters, and we also had a backpack on the animals to measure heart rate. So we had little heart rate electrodes just underneath the surface of the skin, similar to when you go to the doctor and have an ECG, electrocardiogram, to look at the rhythm of your heart. And then we could also, through one of the tubes, we could also change the amount of oxygen that they inhaled by flowing in some nitrogen to mix with the ambient air. So basically what we're trying to do there is to simulate altitude. So if we reduce the oxygen that they're breathing, the pressure is not going to change as it would, you know, if you were actually ascending on climbing Mount Everest or something. But the inspired oxygen, which is what we were interested in, that would actually be lowered overall. So it was a lot of work, but we were actually successful in the end. And it took a long time. It took a lot of trial and error, and we had a lot of setbacks during the project, but it was definitely an incredible learning experience for me and for all of the undergraduate students and others that helped me out with the project. And we finally, actually, I'm very proud to say, we finally published it. And it was actually just last year, since I moved around with my job and then started my job here. We had a little bit of a setback, you know, processing all the data and getting it written, but we finally did. And it was sort of a joke last year. What was gonna get there first? Was the Barheaded goose paper going to take flight before I took flight? And in the end, it actually happened almost about the same time, and the paper was published just before I launched to space.
You mentioned earlier that you had done some research in the Antarctic. I know you have worked as an aquanaut in an underwater environment. You've done training in caves in Spain. So being in these kind of extreme environments, or ones that were very different from the ones you grew up in, what did you learn about yourself from those experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that I like to talk a lot about, because there are really some extraordinary opportunities. And I think it's one of the highlights that we have in training here as astronauts. And it's exactly like you described. If we want to find something useful to compare to spaceflight for training for astronauts or for data collection for other experiments, then what we do is we try to find an environment that has some of those characteristics in common. So is it an inhospitable environment? Is it a small crew living together in a confined space, that kind of thing? So we have a couple different examples that we use regularly to train astronauts. One of those is called NEMO, the NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations. And it's an underwater habitat called Aquarius, which is off of the coast of Key Largo. And I was lucky enough to be a crew member for one of those missions back before I was an astronaut. Actually, when I worked here as a scientist, I did it with a couple of other astronauts and a flight director at the time, and I was evaluating it for the potential to use for life science experiments. And that was way back in 2002. But a really nice example, when you're with a small crew, you're working together on mission objectives, just like we would be on the International Space Station. You need a life support system to go outside. In that case, it's scuba equipment, but still a lot of parallels there. The second one, which I think was an even more effective analog and really up there with some of the most extraordinary experiences of my life, right up there with going to the Antarctic, was the caving mission that you alluded to. And that was actually in Sardinia in Italy. And it was a very technical caving experience. So we were wearing a full harness and sometimes spelunking, kind of straight down a shaft 25 meters into the darkness. So there were a lot of technical skills that we needed, and it wasn't something that I had experience doing, nor any of my other crewmates. So we went for an intensive training period for about 2 weeks before the mission, and it was just like spaceflight. It was an international crew. I had one other American astronaut, there was a Spanish astronaut, a Japanese astronaut, a Russian cosmonaut, and even a Chinese taikonaut. So truly international, even more international than the space station, since China, of course, is not one of our partners there, but really an extraordinary opportunity. We went into that cave for 6 days, and it's just one entrance. But underneath that, through that caving network, there's 25 kilometers of different tunnels and routes underneath there. So it was really like true exploration. And the things that we're really looking to train in that environment are all of those things. If you're not in a real environment that's challenging you mentally and physically, then you're not going to have the same kind of psychological benefit from that training. Because if you're not really challenged, then it's very easy if you're doing some kind of mock setting like that, it's very easy for people to be on their best behavior. And sometimes those elements of your personality that come out under stress, they don't really come out. And the point is to evoke those kinds of personality traits for you and for others, so that you understand more about yourself, you understand more about how to work in a team, how to be a good leader, how to be a good follower, self-care, taking care of the team, all of these elements that are very, very important when you're living with a group of people in a small setting. And it's something that, I think a lot of everybody around the world is dealing with right now, as people are in isolation with their families and in smaller groups and with less ability to kind of go out and get on their own. So these are all really valuable lessons that have a lot of applications even just beyond the International Space Station.
Well, speaking of the space station, I'd like to go back to September 25th of last year when you launched to the space station. And could you walk us through that experience of leaving and traveling to the space station, what you were thinking and what you were feeling while you were doing that?
Yeah, sure. So before launching from Kazakhstan, from Baikonur, we actually are in very intensive training, typically for about 2 years before, where we're going back and forth to Russia. My training period was a little bit condensed, so I had to accomplish all those objectives in a little bit of a shorter period, just because of the way things had been changing with the International Space Station program. So I was over there living and working and really immersed in Russian culture there, because I was in the left seat, which is basically the co-pilot of the Soyuz. So there's 3 seats in the Soyuz. The middle seat is the Russian commander, and that's always a Russian because it's their vehicle. The left seat is essentially the co-pilot, and they need to have a very high level of training to assist the commander pretty much in everything. And then there's the right seat, which actually the spacecraft can be flown with only 2 people. The right seater can, of course, be a very valuable crew member as well and help out, but they have much less responsibility than the other 2. So I was in the left seat as a co-pilot. So I spent a lot of time in Russia, and I relished that. It was amazing. I was a private pilot even before becoming an astronaut. And of course, we all fly the NASA T-38 jet once we get here. So I had some background in aviation, but I'm not a test pilot by background. I'm a scientist. And so for me to be in that setting, learning how to fly a spacecraft and doing so in another language, in Russian, was such an extraordinary opportunity. And it really meant the world to me. I enjoyed it so much. It was certainly challenging learning to do that in another language, but it was very, very rewarding. So when we finally made it to the point on launch day, you're thinking back to all of these hours that you've spent in the simulator, and the simulators in Star City are very high fidelity. Everything looks exactly the same way, which is great because you have all this muscle memory and you just know exactly what to do. You've been through this whole thing a million times, and you get into the launch vehicle. So I actually had to remind myself that this was real, because everything looked exactly the same, and you start doing your normal checks, and I'm talking to Oleg, my commander, in the same way. We're doing everything, and you're of course paying a lot of attention, making sure you're not gonna do anything incorrectly. So I found myself having to remind myself that it was real. And it's interesting because my family and many of my close friends were actually traveled to Baikonur for the launch, and others had viewing parties around the country, and some people were here in Houston. And I think all of those people were much more nervous than I was. I think a lot of us say that. I think the astronaut is usually the calmest one on launch day, because it's just, we know what to do. We've been through the lead up to this before. And so it wasn't, I felt, quite confident in what I was doing, and of course very excited, but until the moments when the rocket started moving and groaning and you would hear something or you would see something out the window during the launch sequence, that's when you know, wow, this is real. And it was just amazing. I mean, I'll never forget the first time I looked out the window to my left and saw the horizon and saw the curvature of the Earth. And when we finally, it doesn't take long before you're in space and you're weightless. And I looked over at my crewmate, Hazza Ali Al Mansouri, who was the first astronaut ever to fly from the United Arab Emirates. He was in the capsule with me. Now, Oleg had had several flights before, so it wasn't as, of course it was exciting for him, but he had experienced it before. So I was looking over at Hazza, just wow, everything started floating. All of the dust or any small items that had fallen to the floor of the capsule, everything started floating up, and we were still strapped in, so we weren't floating completely up yet, but you could feel it in your whole body, and you felt as if you were a bat. I kept saying, I felt like I was a bat hanging upside down, because your body fluids also shift up and kind of move up into your head. So for a while, you feel like you're hanging upside down all the time.
And that first glimpse of Earth from space, did that change your perspective on Earth or your connection to it?
Yeah, that's something that I thought a lot about, and particularly all of the views when you actually have some time to really sit in the cupola and the windows on the space station and look out at the Earth. And I had thought a lot about it before flight, and I think it's really kind of two main categories that I anticipated, and it did really hold true. One of those is that when you see that with your own eyes from the outside, even having seen pictures or video, it's just different, like everything else, when you're experiencing it for yourself. And looking down and you see this very thin, tenuous band of an atmosphere, and you see how beautiful our planet is with all of the oceans and the land masses and the colors and the clouds in the sky, and you realize how special it is. And it is just this brilliant blue ball in the void of blackness around you. And you realize that we really do need to protect it. And environmentalism is something that's always been very important to me and how I live my life. So that wasn't really that surprising to me, but I have talked to other people who haven't thought that much about it before. And they really do see a bigger contrast, when they get to space and they see it with their own eyes and they have that realization. And I think it's a very important one that more people, I wish more people could see it. The second thing is your perspective in terms of our place, how insignificant really we are as humans, even as a planet in the scope of the solar system and the universe. And I think that that's another really important perspective for people to take that time to step back and have a bigger picture. It's so easy for humans. It's really inherent in human nature. It's so easy for us to just get very focused and caught up in the minutia of the current thing that we're dealing with and focusing on. And sometimes that's not the right priority, right? But it's very difficult for us as humans to take that step back. And right now, especially with everything going on the planet and in our country right now, looking down and during this emerging pandemic that we saw unfolding, we returned to a different planet than the one that we left. And it's so easy when you're up there for us seeing that, with seeing these land masses there, you don't see these man-made borders and all of the barriers that men have constructed to keep people away from people. And it's just much easier for us to have the perspective of thinking we are really all in this together. And that applies to environmentalism, to preserving our planet for future generations, because everything that we do, it's not just about us, it's impacting everybody around the world and all the generations to come. And it's the same for the current pandemic. This pandemic has affected all 7.5 billion humans on the planet in some way or another. And that was very strange for us to experience, being the only 3 people that were unaffected by it. And it's the same right now with all of the civil unrest. And just today, I was actually here in Houston and I went to a march for George Floyd, because I think these things are incredibly important for us to all recognize and to listen and to learn from each other and remember that we really are one. We are one human race. And I feel incredibly lucky that I was able to have more of an appreciation of that because of the perspective that you gain when you look down on our planet with your own eyes.
So you mentioned earlier the intensive training that you'd been doing leading up to your arrival at the space station, but was there anything about living and working on the space station that came as a surprise to you, or what was that adjustment like to actually, being there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, we train, essentially I've been training for my space mission for over 6 years. From the time that I started in 2013, we're doing background training for the first 2 years and all sort of the basic astronaut skills. And then of course we're getting into more specific mission training as we go on. So by the time we get to the space station, we are incredibly prepared for everything that we do. In terms of the technical aspects, we have so much familiarity with all of the equipment. We've been exposed to it all. And that's the cool thing about working here at NASA. We as astronauts are the ones that get asked to do these interviews, and we're the faces that people see in the magazines or wherever it is. But it's really the hundreds and thousands of people that work on NASA that are teaching us everything that we need to know. They're really the critical element, not us. We are not the specialists. We're so far from the specialists because we have to kind of dabble in everything and know just enough to do our job. And we rely on the ground heavily for all of the support. So when we get up there, we're incredibly prepared. We're ready to do everything. The one thing that you're not prepared for, that nobody can really train you for, is just how it feels to be in space. The things that become difficult in the beginning are just the everyday things, like learning how to go to the bathroom, how to eat, how to take care of yourself, do simple things like brushing your teeth. Everybody has their own strategy. So that is something that you just can't really teach on the ground. And we do talk to other astronauts in the office, and people will give you their advice beforehand. But I think the most critical time is just at the beginning of your mission. Once you get up there, there are usually other people that have been up there longer than you. And so they show you their tips and tricks, and then you adopt your own and see which strategies work best for you. But that's the one thing that is just, continually surprising. And even though this was something that I looked forward to from the time I was 5 years old, it still blew me away. I said this several times during the mission, that it was even far more incredible than I ever imagined. And I feel like that's saying a lot considering how much I thought about it, but it was really true. Just that feeling of weightlessness and floating all the time. It adds this levity to life that just makes everything so incredible. And having that view that we just talked about, nothing can really prepare you for how that really resonates in your soul.
You had written in your senior yearbook that your future plans were to go for a spacewalk. And you had the opportunity to do that last October when you went on the first all-female spacewalk. So can you tell us about the experience of going out the hatch for the first time and then doing 3 spacewalks while you were up there?
Yeah, I would say those spacewalks are certainly the highlight of my mission. And I think everybody remembers that first one, especially when you come out the hatch for the first time and you're not really sure how you're going to feel, because some people have quite a strong physical response and mental response. And I thought, I thought I was pretty prepared for what it was going to be. And I came out the hatch and I looked down and I saw just my boots and then nothing else but the earth below. And that was just so phenomenal. Unfortunately, you don't have a lot of time to just look and stare back at the earth and kind of appreciate all of that all the time, because spacewalks are really the most challenging thing that we do as astronauts, both mentally and physically. So you have to rely on that training that I described and that muscle memory. And luckily we have so many hours in the spacesuit, and I was very familiar with it, even though of course I wasn't familiar with using the spacesuit in microgravity, since all of our training here is underwater in a pool. It was still the same infrastructure, the same tools, the same interfaces. And so you rely on that muscle memory to just get to work and to focus. And you're out there doing something with millions of dollars of equipment on the line. And that first spacewalk was actually a contingency spacewalk. It wasn't planned. We were in the middle of a series of spacewalks to upgrade the battery channels. Those were the planned spacewalks, where we were upgrading the batteries basically to new lithium-ion batteries, just like you would be using here on the ground. They have a better power capacity, so we would enhance the power supply of the space station with those batteries. But after we had done 2 of those spacewalks, there was a problem in the power channel, and there was a unit called the battery charge discharge unit, which is responsible for getting getting the power out of those, transferring literally what it says, charging and discharging the batteries, and then enabling us to use that power and that energy. And so that had failed. And without that one unit, you can't use that we would have lost an entire power channel on the space station. So that spacewalk that Christina and I ended up doing that day was not the one that we thought we were going to do. It wasn't the one that we were planned to do. So we only had a couple days to figure that out. But that was okay, because that's the way we train at NASA. We had the skills to do it. And, we went out the door that day, and it was something, for me, part of it was just Christina and I doing our job. It was my first spacewalk, so I was very, very focused on what I had to do to prepare for it. And I'd only been up in space for a couple of weeks. It was very early on in my mission. So, it wasn't as if I thought a lot about, wow, well, this is such a big deal because it's with another woman. The thing is that in our class in 2013, when we were selected, there were 50% female and 50% male, and we were all held to the same standard. We all got certified in spacewalking, and we all had the same training regime. So it wouldn't have really made a difference of who I went out the hatch with. But that's not to say that the impact of what we were doing was lost on us. It most certainly wasn't. And looking back on it, and even in the moment, we felt so privileged to be doing what we were doing, to be representing really nothing to do with our own achievements. It had nothing to do with us. We were just the people that happened to be up there. It could have been any of the other women in our office that ended up doing that spacewalk. But really, it's a testament to the generations of women and minorities and everybody that really pushed the boundaries and pushed the envelope to get us where we are today. For me, as I mentioned, it didn't make a difference to me if it was a man or a woman, but it wasn't always that way. We didn't always have a seat at the table. And so we just felt so humbled and really proud to be that representation, that achievement to be the representation of the achievement of all of these generations that had struggled to get us where we are. And, certainly we're still struggling with that in some aspects in our country and in the world with the representation of minorities. And that's very, very apparent right now in everything that's happening in the US. So it is not lost on us what a big deal that was. And to be honest, it was quite overwhelming because I didn't expect such a response. I didn't expect so many people to be so really dedicated and embedded in the event and feel like part of it and have it resonate with them and be inspired by it. I didn't really expect that level of enthusiasm and support. And that was great for us. As individuals, that wasn't the important part. The important part was that enthusiasm for, as I said, all those generations that came before, and for NASA as well, to see all these people paying attention to what we were doing in space. It was really a great moment for us, and we felt very, very privileged.
You often shared photos that you took from the space station on Instagram, and so that people could follow along on your journey. And one of the things that you shared was a photo of Israel, and you wrote about your father's journey and how it was inspirational to a lot of people. So can you tell us about that journey and how it was inspirational to you and why you shared that with people?
Yeah, when we're looking out the window and capturing photographs, it's something that personally was very important to me to capture those images. And from an artistic point of view too, I really like this integration of art with the sciences, this whole STEAM thing. I think that it's really important to blend everything. And I think that we can be much more effective about how we communicate and do outreach if we integrate more variables like that with music, with photography, with art, all of these elements. And so it was something that was personally important to me. I've always loved taking photographs. I never had an SLR camera before though. So, learning how to use that appropriately, a real camera and all the settings, it's actually quite difficult. We've got great training on that on the ground, but you get a lot of that real-time training when you're in space. So the most meaningful part though, of course, are when you're flying over or taking pictures of places that really are meaningful to you. And so I tried to focus a lot on that. Unfortunately, getting great shots of Caribou, Maine is really difficult because it was always cloudy, but I did manage to get some, and some of Maine and all the places that I've lived. And as you mentioned, this photograph of Israel, and that was something, unfortunately, my father passed away not long after I got this job. So he wasn't around to see me launch and go to space. And, that really resonated with me and all of my family. And we actually flew over the Middle East and had great views of the Middle East quite often, just because of its location and our track of our orbit and the fact that it's usually good weather. There were a lot of really nice viewing opportunities there. So I got quite a few shots of Israel during the day and at night. But my dad was really an inspirational individual. One of my cousins once described me and said, well, you're a wanderer just like your father, always, going around the next corner and wandering around and finding something else. And my dad did that. He was he was born actually in Baghdad, and his family left when he was only 6 years old. So he grew up in Israel, but it was formerly Palestine back then. And then he was really all over the world. He was he finished medical school in Switzerland. He was in Europe. He was in Canada. He was back in Israel, and he met my mother in Sweden when they were both working in Sweden at the time. And so he was really all over the place. So maybe that's one of the other reasons why that really stimulated me to explore. And his journey was I think inspirational to me for all of those reasons.
Once you came back from your mission, what was it like to acclimate back to life on Earth, both physically and emotionally? And how long does that take to do that?
Well, I think it's still in process. I keep saying, and it's true, I'd much rather still be floating. So watching that launch, the SpaceX launch just a few days ago, and seeing Bob and Doug take off, I was a little bit jealous. But it is an interesting process, and I think it's scientifically interesting because it's much more difficult to come back than it is to go up there. And you think, we've evolved as a human species with gravity through the entire evolution of humankind. So you'd think that returning to what you were evolved for as a species should be easier. But if you think about the distribution of forces and how gravity works, I guess it also makes sense that it would be a little bit more difficult coming back with the force of gravity, weighing down on you than going up there. And that was definitely true. Your body does take some time to readjust. And for many people, there's quite a strong vestibular component. So your inner ear, which are responsible for your inner ear elements, which are responsible for balance and spatial orientation, that kind of thing. A lot of those mechanisms in which they operate are dependent on gravity. So when you go up to space, some people feel a bit ill, some people get some motion sickness. That happens on the way down too if you move your head, because those inner ear organs are just not really used to that. So it takes a little bit of time to readjust to that. And then for me, I didn't have a very strong vestibular response, so I didn't have that kind of motion sickness going up or coming back down. But you do feel very strange. You feel as if you weigh hundreds of pounds. I remember being on the airplane after we landed, coming back to the US, and I picked up my tablet. And it was weird because, I know how much a tablet, it was the same kind that we use in space. I know it's, pretty light, but it felt as if it weighed 30 pounds. It was just because my brain had really readjusted to how things were in microgravity. It takes time for those neural connections to kind of change back to dealing with this gravity. So it's quite an interesting process. You feel a bit, kind of tired and like someone's kind of pushing you down into the ground for several weeks. And it's been 6 weeks now, and I would say I feel mostly normal. I can't run quite as fast. Running is one of the last things to come back because it's this complex motor neuron connection with your brain and your muscles, and it's more complicated than just walking. Walking feels normal, but for some reason running takes a little bit more time to come back. But it's definitely an interesting process, and having come back to a different planet like the one that we returned to has made the adjustment even more interesting.
Well, this evening we have many children joining us who say that they see you as an inspiration, and they may dream of being an astronaut or doing something else. I know one person watching is a 12-year-old girl from up in Mars Hill named Hannah, who dresses you for Halloween and aspires to follow in your footsteps. What advice do you have for kids about following their dreams, whether it's to go to space or to do something else?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to make sure, as you just said, to go to space or do something else, to make sure that it's their passion, to make sure that it's the one thing that really drives them and gets them excited. Because I truly think that you can't excel at something, and more importantly, you can't be happy doing it if it's not something that you really care about, that really ignites that fire within you. So that's the first step. And then of course it does take a lot of hard work and dedication and perseverance. And you have to be willing to take risks. Even though it might be really scary, you need to be able to take a risk and to realize that you might fail. And it's a good thing to fail along the way, because that's when you learn the most valuable lessons. And I can tell you that I have failed along the way, as have all the other astronauts that are here. And that's just part of the process. So you have to be willing to do that. I think for us as astronauts too, there's actually just a lot of luck involved. There are so many people that I met that interviewed that were equally or even more capable of doing this job than me. But it's just a matter of timing in the end and the right blend of people. At NASA, we're picking astronaut classes. We're not just picking individuals. So we have to have the right combination of the types of peoples and backgrounds. So there's a lot that goes into it. But I think the bottom line is if you find that one thing that you love and really stick to it, then it sounds quite trite, but I'm proof right here that your 5-year-old dream, even if you're from somewhere like Caribou, Maine, it can come true.
Well, now we'd like to go ahead and take some questions from our Zoom guests tonight. If you have a question for Jessica, you can put it in the Q&A function, or if you'd like to ask her directly, you can use the raise your hand option, and then make sure to unmute yourself if we call on you. So. Let's see, I want to start with a question that we received from Eliza, who says, as you know, Maine is recognized as having one of the last dark skies in North America. Could you see the dark area that is Maine's North Woods from space?
Yeah, you can. And that's interesting, because when people ask me what it was that got me interested in space, and I talked about, I remember going up to Thomas Park in New Sweden and looking at the stars, and I didn't even realize how fortunate we were of how incredible the stars are in northern Maine, because that was just the way I grew up. It was only after I left that I realized how good I had it. And you can see that. You can see big differences in city lights. When we fly over and it's dark on the ground, you can see all of that. You can see the lights of the cities, you can see the unpopulated areas. And so yeah, certainly if we flew over at that time, and if there weren't clouds blocking it, I could definitely see that darker spot in northern Maine.
And I have a question here from Mark Adams, who says, we take so much for granted here on Earth, the wind, the birds, the rain, snow. What did you miss most while you were in space?
Those are the things that I thought that I was going to miss the most. I thought, when I'm on Earth, I love being outside in nature. I love hiking, and I love being in the woods, and I love being in the ocean and skiing in the snow. And so I thought, man, it was going to be difficult to not be able to experience any of those aspects of nature. And some astronauts describe it as a little bit ironic, because we have this seat where we're looking down on the most beautiful views of all of the ecosystems of the planet, but you can't actually experience any of them. And, I of course, if I thought about it at the time, I thought, okay, yeah, it would be fun to go skiing right now. But it was interesting. I actually didn't miss anything. And I think that's just because the whole experience was so unique and so alien and so wonderful in so many different ways that I was just completely consumed and stimulated by everything else that was going on around me, that I didn't find myself really missing those things from home.
Right. We have a question from Amy, who asks, or she's wondering if you ever worked a potato harvest growing up in Caribou, and if you did, what kind of impact did that have on your life?
Of course I picked potatoes. Everyone did, right? Actually, the answer is that I'm a little bit ashamed to say I never worked a whole potato season. But that was just one of the things that my family did, was we usually went away on vacation during harvest. So I didn't really have the option. But some of my siblings did. And so I had a couple experiences when I was younger that I did work a couple days. I went, and I think that I remember the one day that I worked, I picked 8 barrels or something, or maybe it was 16 barrels, so it was only $8 or something. I think it was 50 cents a barrel back then, or something crazy, for the amount of backbreaking labor that we did. But our family certainly does have some experience in that arena, and I think it's probably very formative for us growing up and doing that kind of work.
And we do have a hand up. Maria Palopoli, you can go ahead and unmute and you'll be able to ask your question.
Hi, Jessica. I'm so happy to be able to ask this question. I'm a science teacher, and I just wonder what your idea is about the likelihood of non-astronauts going into space, given the stringent physical demands. Like, how realistic is that?
Yeah, Maria, I'm glad you asked that. I think I've seen that pop up a little bit in the chat stream, so it seems like a lot of people have those questions. The answer right now is that I'm not really sure. I think we are at this precipice where we're trending in the right direction now that we have these commercial companies like SpaceX and Boeing building rockets. all of this is increasing the market and making space more accessible. We have a lot of other companies too that have been doing more space tourism oriented things. They're not actually sending astronauts to the space station, but there's, for example, Virgin Galactic doing suborbital flights. There's several different companies that are trying to do things like that to give people a little bit of a taste of what it's like to be in space. And I think that those opportunities would certainly be more open to all kinds of people, you know, independent of some of the factors that you were talking about in terms of, you know, physical regimes. But I think it's really an exciting time right now. I think that we're going to find out a lot more about that soon. I do think the answer is space is going to start being more and more accessible all the time, and hopefully we'll get to a point where really it's you know, much more common for many more people to be able to experience it.
And we have another question from Samira Mohamed. You can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Well, my name is really Herman. I'm using my mom's computer, and I've wanted to be an astronaut since I was 5, and I have a question for you. Actually, 2 questions. The first question is, how does it feel when it was your first launch? How did you feel when the rocket was going up?
Well, I was incredibly excited. I think sort of how I described earlier, I was very busy focusing on the computers in front of me and making sure that we were monitoring all the right things. So we were very involved in that. But once the stages of the rocket started separating, you know, after the first stage uses all of its fuel, it actually falls away from the vehicle, and you can actually see some of those dynamic events happening outside of your window. And so it was just absolutely thrilling to realize that my dream was coming true.
Yeah, I actually have, sorry to bother you, but I have just one quick question and then another question and then I'm done. Before you were talking, I searched you up on Google and I saw a picture of you on the spacewalk. I know that there's no gravity on the moon, but I don't, like, on your perspective, how did the moon feel like when you're walking on it?
Well, I've never been to the moon, unfortunately. I was just on the International Space Station. Oh. And the International Space Station is in orbit about 250 miles above the Earth. And so we have microgravity there, so everything floats. You don't weigh anything, nothing weighs anything. But the surface of the moon is a little bit different because there is a gravitational field from the moon itself. And that actually is much less than it is on Earth. So on Earth, you're familiar with how it feels. If you're on the moon, the gravity is about 1/6 of what it is that here on Earth. So the Apollo astronauts that did go to the moon back in the 60s and early 70s, if you see videos of them, you can see they're kind of bouncing around when they walk. And that's because they weigh much less. So they can sort of propel themselves up and bounce around a little bit more. You get a little bit more spring in their step. But at NASA, we are currently working to send humans back to the moon. We have a program called Artemis, and hopefully we will be sending humans back to the moon in the next few years. So we'll see. I would love the opportunity to be one of those people that gets to go, but that is, we'll see how it all plays out.
And we'll take another question from Robert Ashton. You are all set to go ahead and unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, a quick question. I understand that the twins, that one of whom went to space for a year and the other didn't, they wound up after the trip with different physiological circumstances. You are now readjusting to weight. You're going to say you're going to essentially get all the way back to your normal self. But my question is, if you go to Mars, and instead of 1 year, you're talking 3 or 4 months in space and several times over there, are you really going, is that really practical from the physiological standpoint?
Yeah, so I was in space for about 7 months. As you were alluding to, Scott Kelly was there for just under a year. And there have been some Russian cosmonauts that have been there for even longer. So we have been studying exactly what you're talking about to make sure that we do fully understand what will happen if we do send humans to Mars. And that would probably be about a 3-year mission. So we have decades actually of physiological research now, and I was a subject for some of those experiments. We know a lot about what happens to the human body. And one of the ways that we can prevent the bones from from losing density and the muscles from atrophying is exercise. And so we have some amazing exercise equipment on board the International Space Station. We exercise every day. It's a very important part of our routine. And that helps us come back and still be functional when we return to Earth. Same is true for Mars. It'll be a little bit more challenging because the exercise equipment on the space station is quite large, takes up a lot of space. So we need some different equipment, and that is something that we're actively working at NASA to develop the right exercise equipment that's small enough that you could bring it in the capsule with you all the way to Mars. But it's a great question. It's one we're working on. I think in terms of bones and muscles, we would be okay for that long period of time. The one question that's the biggest unanswered question physiologically right now is still the effect of radiation. So the amount of radiation that you would receive on that voyage going to Mars would be pretty high. So we have to be able to shield humans from that, or come up with some other way of dealing with that radiation so it doesn't have those deleterious effects on the human body, causing things like cancer, causing mutations and changes to our DNA. So great question. I think it's possible. I think we can do it, but a little bit more work on radiation I think will help us get there.
All right. Well, we have a question from Samantha, who's wondering if you could talk about the food that you ate in space. Were there things that you like, and what was that? And were there things that you were looking forward to eat when you got back here?
Yeah, well, I would encourage you. My crewmate Drew Morgan and I put some videos out on social media, on my Instagram account and my Twitter account, which is @astro_Jessica. We put some videos out to show exactly that and to show some of these everyday things. We have one on hygiene where I wash my hair and Drew is shaving, and we have one on exercise, and then we have one about preparing food and some of the foods that we have up there. The first answer is it is a lot of fun to eat up there. It's way more fun than it is down here because things are floating and you can pass things to your friends and grab them, you know, right out of the air, and it's a lot of fun. We have a whole lab at NASA that actually is developing new food all the time. So people often think, oh, you're going to have some dehydrated food that tastes terrible. Actually, our food these days is really good. We have things that are ranging all the way to Indian fish curry and Turkish fish stew and kale and Brussels sprouts and braised cabbage and all the, and then, you know, if you just want your steak and some potatoes or maybe some meatloaf, we have all those options too. So there are a lot of different options and they keep people pretty happy. We also get to eat food and share food with our Russian cosmonauts. We get some Russian foods and also the European astronauts as well. So there's pretty good variety up there. And I gotta say, the food has come a long way. It is really delicious.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. So, Jessica, thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing so much about your experiences with us. We appreciate it, and I hope you get back to Maine pretty soon.
I hope so too. It's wonderful, at least letting my voice go out on the airways in Maine. That really means a lot to me. So hello to all my family and friends and everybody. Thank you so much for all of your support. I certainly wouldn't be here without all of the support you've provided all along the way. Hope to see you soon.